Hi, I'm Avery Bergman.
I'm Sophia Lindquist.
I'm Theo Chen.
And I'm Sarai Cardenas.
Today we're going to be talking about a term coined by Pauline Boss called ambiguous loss. We'll be discussing research that has been done on it, as well as our own personal experiences with it.
Ambiguous loss was founded and studied by Pauline Boss in the late 1990s, early 2000s. This idea stemmed from her college thesis and her post-grad studies.
Boss defined ambiguous loss in a podcast with Christine Tippett as an illogical, chaotic, unbelievably painful situation in 2020.
This situation and the pain it elicits leads to a life of chronic grief if it is not approached and confronted by the person experiencing it. It is often uncontrollable, complicated, and very hard to move past because the person grieving lacks facts and information that would typically help them cope. This can be a lack of a physical body, such as with a missing person, a lack of psychological presence with someone incrementally disappearing as a result of dementia or Alzheimer's, or any other lack of concrete facts that will never be answered or uncovered. Coping with the idea of never having answers can make this grief extremely difficult.
There are two types of ambiguous loss that were listed, including type 1, which is physical presence and psychological absence, which would be dementia and mental illness, where people are incrementally disappear, but there's also physical absence and psychological presence, including things such as an incarcerated parent or a child left in the foster care system. In other words, type 2 would include a restriction of not being physically present in someone's life, but being emotionally and psychologically present.
Due to the lack of a reason, explanation, or closure, this type of loss is typically hard to move past and impossible to come to terms with. Ambiguous loss is not a loss that is concrete and factual. For example, ambiguous loss is not losing your phone or having a loved one die due to old age and health concerns. These losses can be expected, prepared for, and backed by facts.
If someone who experiences loss is able to understand the loss, cope with it, and move on, it is not typically defined as ambiguous loss. Personally, when my grandma died of old age, she had been in the hospital for a few weeks and had many health concerns. Because we all knew she was going to die at some point and knew that what she was going to die from, it is not an example of ambiguous loss.
Overall, Boss's coined term is a nonsensical and lifelong loss. Her defining and studying this term has led to many conversations, studies, and research on how this loss is prevalent in different situations and how one can move forward from an ambiguous loss.
Ambiguous loss is important to recognize and define. With those steps, we can recognize our own losses as well as help others. We have each done individual research, and hopefully one topic resonates with you.
Yeah, while reading an article on the emotional burden of caregivers, I thought that this was an excellent example of ambiguous loss. The article specifically focuses on caregiver mental health and feelings of ambiguous loss after reassuming responsibilities from a dementia patient who has experienced hospice discharges. Oftentimes, hospice discharges occur as a result of an out-of-sync physical and mental state. When patients are discharged, caregivers lose a very important support system, the hospice, and gain responsibilities over a loved one whose well-being seems ever-changing. The article identifies newfound responsibility that alters the relationship between loved ones and dementia patients. These new feelings experienced by the caregiver are an example of ambiguous loss as caregivers experience the uncertainty of an incremental death, as stated by Pauline Boss. A hospice discharge of patients gives an ambiguous message and allows caregivers to feel very uncertain about what expectations to have. The responsibility of another life places a huge burden on caregivers as well. Though most of the focus is given to the dementia patients, the ever-changing roles of loved ones and their boundaries with the patients leads to much stress and anxiety. Ambiguous loss can also apply to other circumstances that may not be related to dear ones. Not only is ambiguous loss a real thing, it was specifically coined and recognized to help professionals recognize not only the effects of this specific trauma, but to learn to assist those experiencing loss without a concrete explanation and condition.
So I have a question for you. How does acknowledging that this is an ambiguous loss help caregivers cope with losing dementia patients?
Sure, and I feel like this applies not only to caregivers as well, but in terms of all ambiguous loss. By recognizing that it is an ambiguous loss, we are assigning it a name and really recognizing that it's a special type of loss that should be taken with more seriousness, and also that by giving it a title, we are validating that it's a different type of loss, right? So not being able to fully cope and dealing with the ever-changing conditions of having to care for someone who is not really mentally there, but physically always there. We're more so like allowed to really just like assign a meaning to that. Yeah, I hope that answered your question.
That did, thank you.
Mhm.
And that kind of relates to the research I did of like questioning your role in life. And we're currently facing a lot of losses in America due to overdoses and addictions. And there are some addicts in these situations and their bystanders and loved ones. Though it is very important to support those addicted to drugs, there are often little resources and support for those involved. I read an article describing the psychological effects and ambiguous loss that is experienced as a female co-sibling of an addict. This researcher focused specifically on female siblings who experience this due to her own personal experience, as well as the preconceived roles that society places on women. Women are often pressured to act as a caregiver in these families, friendships, and other relationships. So when this caregiving is of an addict, one can question their purpose. Besides these concepts, this researcher mentioned how when they have a sibling who is an addict, this addiction creates an ambiguous loss of a normal relationship between the sibling's relationship to her parents, as well as her sibling who is an addict. Knowing that their sibling is still the same person but is not psychologically present elicits an intense strain as well as a fear of repetition within later caretaking roles for the sibling. This is an example of Boss's physically present but psychologically absent philosophy. If this addiction was experienced as an adolescent, this addiction may lead to the co-sibling to suppress their emotions, feel guilt towards the situation, and may feel hopeless of a healthy future. These effects are important to recognize and treat with therapy and other medical professions because not only do addicts deserve help, but those involved need attention and understanding as well.
Yeah, I totally agree with what you're saying, and I feel like by recognizing it's an ambiguous loss, it's kind of similar to um, my case, and it's not really the addict's fault, and more so like what you're experiencing, you can't really fully blame the addict for it. So I really get behind that. And I feel like the the dementia patient is kind of similar to the addict per se because they're both kind of physically there, but not as so mentally there. Yeah.
Yeah, and the caregivers and the hospice care, they both feel like they can't really feel bad about themselves because they're not the ones with addiction or dementia. And I think that this term kind of gives them a sense of why they feel the way they feel.
Exactly.
I have an example of ambiguous loss having to deal with the foster system and how foster parents cope with when foster children are removed from their homes. So, a study done in 2020 conducted research among 10 foster parents in order to understand the emotional experience when a foster child is removed from their home. This study was conducted through a lens of acknowledging that this is an ambiguous loss, and the data and results gathered from the participants validated that this grief was complicated due to the lack of information they had regarding the child after they left the home. While there remains a psychological feeling of having the child in the family, they are no longer physically present in the home. Regardless of how or why the child was removed, parents can feel an ambiguous loss because of their lack of a continued connection with the child and the lack of knowledge of what the future holds for the child. This is also experienced by other family members, such as siblings and really anyone else who knows the child as part of the family. It's a situation in which someone was brought in, considered a member of the family, treated like a member of the family, and one day is just no longer in their lives. The foster child is living somewhere else, and the foster family no longer experiences their physical presence as part of the family, even if they still mentally think of them as a member of the family.
So I have a question for you relating to your article. So oftentimes foster children are moved from home to other homes. Do you think the bond that has been created between a foster parent and a child will determine how much of an ambiguous loss either the child or the parent will experience?
Yeah, that's a really good question, and that's actually a really big part of the research that they did and the results that they found. So it definitely is true that if a foster child is kind of established in a home for longer and they make more of a bond, there's definitely going to be a larger feeling of an ambiguous loss because they've really established that child as a member of the family. And then something that I thought was really interesting in the research was finding how the knowledge of ambiguous loss can help the foster system and help parents who may be reluctant to foster again. So kind of preparing them for this loss and helping them through it shows them that they're not alone in it, and it's something that's experienced by a lot of people. And also, since a lot of times the fear of losing a child makes some parents resistant to form a deep connection, knowing that this is experienced by so many people can really like help them feel confident in having a deep connection to the child, and just know that there will be resources and help for when they do have to deal with that ambiguous loss.
So ambiguous loss can be reflected, as mentioned above, as psychologically present yet physically absent. Such examples include deportation from the perspective of adults who had parents deport them when they were a child. In this article I researched, it was conducted with 10 adults who were interviewed, and they discussed their experience. So as a collective group, it was seen that the adults had a misunderstanding to why this was occurring to them, because their parents chose to not disclose that information even when they're younger, not giving them, or like not talking to them and having to sit down and just explain to them this is a possibility that might happen. So when it did happen, they didn't really know how to cope with it or how to continue moving on, because they were never presented with that talk. It was seen that most of the adults recalled their parents' absence, but were unsure why they no longer saw them. Initially, they believed their parent would return within a few months, because parents felt it was better not to disclose the information to the child, which led to some rifts between family members. Some reflected that because they were shielded, they blamed other family members, such as one who thought his father was having an affair with his stepmother and thought that was the reason why his mother left. Given their young age, when their parent was deported, parents chose not to disclose that information again to allow their child to keep their innocence. In order to come with the terms, the child then had to come up with their own explanation to why their parent was deported. Overall, as they grew up, they just felt lost and reminisced on the family they once had.
I had a question on what you think would help the situation, because I was wondering if, like, the parents shielding their kids, do you think that was a good thing to do because the kids were so young, or do you think that just led them to more confusion and loss later on in life?
I think at a certain point they understood why it happened. I think given their young age, I personally feel like the parents should have sat down and talked to them, because it could happen abruptly, and like other children or like other adults mentioned that they felt that it was the fault of another family member to why their parent had gone or left, and that just created conflict within the family because they didn't wish to like disclose that information. And then comparing it to adult who had been told and been disclosed with the information, she explained that she understood why it happened, and it just helped her maintain her family and cherish those moments, knowing that it might happen to her other parents. So I think it's just better to disclose that information sooner than.
That makes a lot of sense. If you're interested in learning more about ambiguous loss, the forms it comes in, as well as ways to cope, you can visit our class's website at tinyurl.com/r4bproof for more examples and resources. A personal experience of ambiguous loss was the dementia of my grandfather last year. He recently died, and I felt this sense of physical presence and psychological absence as he was experiencing dementia. But soon my grandpa forgot my name, and he always remembered that I was going to Berkeley because he lived there for a period of time. Not only was I grieving the incremental death of my grandfather, I was also struggling with the fact that I had not fostered a strong enough relationship with him throughout my life. Though I know it is not my fault that he had dementia and eventually lost memory of his family, I felt severe guilt around his death and forgetting. Recognizing this definition and looking at my experience through the lens of ambiguous loss helped me understand why I felt so guilty, and I don't know, it made me feel like I wasn't the only one who has felt this physical presence and psychological absence before.
Yeah, no, I feel that. I feel like because my grandmother actually right now is suffering from dementia as well. So I think that it's a really common thing. And I'm not
Mhm.
trying to say that to like invalidate how you feel because everybody's feelings are valid, especially regarding loss, right? But I'm kind of just curious too. How like where does your guilt come from? Because for me, I felt like when you said that line about not fostering a strong enough connection with him throughout his life and throughout your life, that kind of hit home for me. What about you?
Yeah.
Like, where's your guilt from?
It was mostly like the fact that he had been in a nursing home for a couple of years, and every time my parents wanted me to visit him in high school, I was like, ugh, like dreading it all the time. And I had this like fear of people that were older than me, like grandparents, and I thought that they would like I wasn't allowed to be myself around them, so that made me feel like I couldn't really be close with them. And looking at a lot of people in my life, like I noticed that they're really close with their grandparents, and it made me regret like all the time I had with him and not really trying hard enough to like actually form a relationship with him. And then when I matured and realized that, it was just too late. So that's where my guilt was coming from.
Dude, yeah, mine is around the same because I felt like, and my grandparents are all like overseas in different countries living their own lives, and I felt like whenever I had a chance to get on the phone with them, I was always like shying away from it. Whenever my mom would
Hmm.
be on the phone with them, she'd try to hand it to me. I was kind of like afraid to talk to them too, afraid of. I'm not really sure why, but it definitely
No, I
makes me,
totally relate.
and I wish I knew them better as people.
Hmm.
Yeah. I think the ambiguous loss that I've experienced is kind of similar to that as well. It was around when I was 15. So I still kind of vividly remember it, like when I was mid conversation with my father and he like holds up a hand in silence, right? I remember him like holding up his hand and I was confused why I was being quiet. And he picks up the phone and hands it to my mother. And she speaks first, right? And I hear her being super excited in her tone. And I watched as like her face and her tone quickly shifted and she was less and less excited and her face kind of grew stiffer and stiffer. And I think this was when I first found out that my grandfather, the one that I should have spent more time with, had gone into a coma. And now looking back at it, as I've grown older, I've kind of gained more information about the circumstances, right? Because around that time, I felt like my parents also shielded me and kept my innocence almost, like trying to preserve my innocence. So as I've grown older, I've kind of gained more information about the circumstance surrounding my grandfather, and I feel like looking back at it now, I recognize it as a really big ambiguous loss, especially at the time, like when I lacked so much information too. Like experiences I was able to share with my grandfather from my dad's side, I couldn't share with my mother's father, my maternal grandfather, and I really wish I did. Like looking back at it now, and I imagine like the lost possibilities of what memories I could have made. And I think that looking back at it now, it was a huge ambiguous loss as I struggled to like wrap my head around the situation. There's just a lot of missed opportunities to make memories as well. Yeah.
Yeah, that
Hmm.
totally makes sense. And I think especially with a coma, with it being so sudden, it's kind of different from Alzheimer's or dementia, which I also experienced with my grandpa, where it's like very gradual and you don't really notice it happening or notice the changes. It kind of just happens over time. But with a coma that's really sudden, I'm sure it would be hard to deal with suddenly having the physical presence, but not the psychological at all.
Hmm.
Yeah.
And I've definitely seen like people talk about comas and how like they keep them around as long as possible and still talk to them and treat them like how they used to treat them. And I think that's just, it might be a good example on how to cope with the loss, but it's also, it might be like staying stagnant in the situation and like, I
Yeah.
don't know,
I feel like
causing yourself more grief.
yeah, because while like I'm thinking back at it now, right? When I used to visit during the summer, I would hold his hand, which wouldn't really hold mine. I was just holding his hand, right? And it was kind of as if I was like giving myself hope and giving my family hope.
Hmm.
I just I don't know, there wasn't really an end to it, and I felt like having that hope low-key made it more of a loss and kind of hurt a little bit more. Yeah.
Hmm.
But what Avery you were saying was pretty interesting. I was hoping you could elaborate on your experiences with like a grandparent.
Yeah, I really related to what Sophia was talking about when I had my grandfather die from Alzheimer's. It was years ago when I was really young, so my grasp of it was not as clear as what I have now, but looking at it through a lens of ambiguous loss kind of helped me understand what I was feeling and how I processed his death. So, my when he had Alzheimer's, he was slowly withering away, and I saw him over time lose more and more of his memory and just his regular functioning. And I never really like understood how it was a gradual loss. It just kind of seemed like he was just losing his memory, and one day he was just not at all who he was. But now I realize that an ambiguous loss is a perfect way to describe it, especially with that incremental disappearance and how it just kind of gets more and more over time. Even though my grandfather was physically present for years after he was diagnosed with Alzheimer's, his memory, personality, and regular mannerisms slowly went away until psychologically he really wasn't the same at all. The psychological absence happened slowly, and I couldn't really identify specifics of how he was changing over time until it ultimately led to him being put into a home for people with Alzheimer's, and then shortly after that, he died. But at that point, his death didn't really feel very different since all that really was left was his physical body, but his psychological presence was completely gone at that point. I think my family and I had already grieved the loss of him psychologically while he was getting worse and worse over time. He died in 2018, but it felt like I had lost him long before because his psychological presence disappeared much earlier than 2018. Acknowledging this as an ambiguous loss helped me understand why I really grieved him more when he was incrementally disappearing psychologically, versus when he actually died, because the death didn't feel like his physical death didn't really feel like the death, but rather the disappearance that was happening for years before.
Yeah, I'm sorry you had to go through that. But I feel like also you learn a lot in the process, right? And yeah, like you were saying, recognizing that it's an ambiguous loss really helps with how you cope now looking back at the situation.
Yeah, I think it helped me understand it a little more. And while at first I was kind of confused, like I remember talking to my mom recently about what my grandpa was like prior to when he had Alzheimer's. And since he was diagnosed when I was so young, I didn't really know him or have much memory of him before. So it was hard for me to identify like what the before was and what the end was. And it just kind of felt like this um long stretch of time where he was just gradually disappearing, and I just like didn't really know what he was like before because I couldn't really remember it, and I didn't really have like a feeling or a image in my head of like what he was like before it.
Mhm. I kind of relate to that in a way because though I knew my grandpa before dementia and I remember how he was, it was like we didn't really have that deep of a relationship. Like we would just see each other at family events and have casual conversation and I would move on. Felt like I was losing something that I never really had, which made me feel guilty, as I mentioned earlier, but it also made me feel pretty confused on like what a granddaughter grandparent relationship was supposed to look like. And I don't know, it made me have a lot of trouble like recognizing why my dad would go and see his dad and come back so sad because I was like, he's the same he's always been, but he really wasn't to him because he's known him for twice as long as I had. But yeah.
Yeah, Sophia, I also related a lot to what you were saying before about how it was hard when you would visit or when you didn't really want to go visit him at the old age home. And I kind of had a similar experience with that. It was really hard for me to go there and see all these other Alzheimer's patients. And it was kind of just this overwhelming feeling of like sadness. And especially there, it's like my grandpa was so like psychologically not himself at that point. So when I went, I didn't really know like what to talk to him about or how to really interact with him. And then
Mhm.
there was this kind of complicated feeling where I'm like, I know I should be going and I know that I need to see him, but it just doesn't feel like I have a connection to him. And it becomes this like complicated inner struggle of how to deal with that.
Yeah, I relate to that totally.
Yeah, I relate to that as well. I feel like from my personal experience with my father just recently passed away. So then, from what you were saying, Avery, I really relate to that. It's like, um, that for me, it's like that connection I once had with him was gone. And then as now that I reflect on his passing, I feel like, him being away from me for years because my father was deported, when I was, I believe, a sophomore. So when researching and learning about Ambiguous laws, I posed something I deeply connected to, which was the article about deportation, because I didn't know what I was feeling. Like, I knew I missed him. I knew he was an important figure in my life, but I didn't think of it as much more than that. Just that I had my father deported. He was in a different country, and he still kept communication with me. Unlike the lives of the people I researched about, it was quite different because for me it did happen when I was a bit older than they were. And I already had that understanding of what deportation is, and I knew that it's possible in my family for both my parents to be deported. They they never actually sat me down to talk to me and like tell me this is something that might happen. It's just something I always knew was a possibility. I don't know how actually, but it's something like coming as a Hispanic uh person, it's just something you know, but it's not really talked about, I would say. So when I heard the news that my father was arrested, it was hard because I still had hope that no backstory is like he got arrested and then it wasn't him that they were looking for, but because he was arrested, they were still gonna deport him even though it wasn't like it wasn't him who like they were looking for. He was still gonna like that was still gonna be the outcome. So when he told me when he had his court date and they like told us that he found the guy who like they were actually looking for, we still had hope that he was gonna come back, but he didn't. And when he told me, I was sad, but a part of me knew that he was gonna have to leave the country. So reflecting on this term, it really helped me digest and have a new perspective on my experience. I compared to terms like I mentioned, like what I was really revolving my dad's deportation. I think it was the transition from like constant presence in my life to like psychological presence and physical absence, which was difficult. I think unlike other people, I was able to cope with it because my parents did divorce when I was in like elementary, and it was like when I was first grade. So I have I have had time where it's like sometimes I didn't see my father and he was so tall. So then I guess in that aspect I kind of already knew how it felt like, but I guess it was different because there's also important moments I knew he was always gonna be there, and it was just different knowing that this time around he wasn't gonna be able to come. So then comparing my experience with those I've learned, I felt like I understand what I went through a little bit more, and I feel like I understand what you went through, Avery, because um my connection with him wasn't the best, I would say. In his like remaining days, I think it wasn't the best. So then I guess it's just hard because the last time I saw him was when I was like a sophomore and he passed away, so it's just I'm never gonna see him again. That's it's just hard to like comprehend that and like realize I had a good connection with him. It probably wasn't the one I wanted to have. So but I just with this term it just helped me learn like um helping me cope with understanding that I did the best I could, and I am happy with the relationship we had. We might have not had the best connection like we did when he was here, but it was a connection that we were able to manage being, I would say, in a whole different country, you know?
Mhm.
So yeah, so even like, so even when he was living like in Mexico, he continued to be a parent figure in my life. So it was like constantly he will call me, even in college, like constantly he'll call me every single day. He had his set time where he will call me. So then I think it's just difficult to move on with something. Yeah, so I think it was just like a difficult transition going to adulthood without him, or like even the memorable events such as graduation or my birthday, knowing he wasn't gonna be there. Like he was one.
Yeah. I think the term, I can see how it helped you a lot because I feel like in media and other people in their lives, it's pretty rare to lose a parent and it's not really represented very well. And just parents are like viewed as somebody who's supposed to be there your whole life and they're supposed to be supportive and like a parent figure. And a lot of the times it's either they're physically there, but they're not like giving you this parent figure, or in your case, they weren't there, but they were being a good parent figure. And I'm really sorry also that you ever had to go through that because it just seems terrible to lose somebody who is such a big part of your life. And especially at that age when you already had like a pretty good connection with him and knew him and recognized him, it's really hard. And I don't know, you're very strong.
Yeah. So I feel like this is like the term that has helped me to understand what I'm going through and like knowing how to adapt moving forward. Like I think it's deportation is really out there and it's talked about a lot. As a child of an immigrant, you know the possibility of like your parent being deported, but I guess it never occurred to me what my actual feelings were gonna happen or like the changes that were actually going to happen if one of my parents.
Do you think like if you knew it was an ambiguous loss at the time and you knew that definition when you were like when it first initially happened and you're experiencing it, it would have made it better?
No. I think I think in the beginning, I think every loss is hard to cope with, but I feel like reflecting on the term will help you move forward with it and like understand what you're dealing with. Something that was mentioned by Pauline Boss is that I think just time helps you heal and like comprehend and like with my father's passing, I feel like I blame myself for not having the most perfect connection with him. But even though I was already restricted from that, I think time has helped me heal and like understand his death and like understand that my relationship with him was a great one. And that's just something I have to hold on.
Yeah, thank you so much for sharing. I really understand that, especially with the feeling of kind of wishing that the relationship while they were still present was a little different, or that you would have I don't know, like spent more time. But I think that that was something I felt a lot with my grandpa when he started disappearing psychologically with his Alzheimer's, and I think that acknowledging it as an ambiguous loss now kind of helps me get rid of that element of guilt and know that there's not, like, knowing that there was that one presence while there wasn't another, there's not really much I could have done before he started disappearing psychologically, because I didn't know that was going to happen, and I didn't really like understand how it was going to happen. And I think that acknowledging that there's really nothing I could have done, and yeah, just like kind of taking any blame off it's hard, but it's helpful in coping with it, I think.
Yeah, I understand that. I feel like it just helps you move from point A to point B.
Let's go into Pauline Boss's like suggested strategies that she listed in her podcast. The first one that she mentioned that could help with an ambiguous loss would be like finding meaning. I feel like personally for me, this strategy would really help me because it would like assign a significance where it's really due and kind of validate my emotions. Because I feel like as a kid, when I was experiencing that, I wasn't really sure if what I was feeling was how I was supposed to be feeling based off how I was thinking, you know? And if my mindset was really like valid almost. I felt like I was in a way gaslighting myself. Yeah.
Yeah, I understand that. And I feel like just humans in general, we're always, I think I mentioned it in the podcast, but we're always looking for like a certain way to do things like procedurally. And with this type of loss, and up until recently and up until this class, really, I didn't really know what it was. And without knowing what it was, I think it makes it a lot harder to deal with it. And because of our tendencies to be so like strict and like lists and procedures. And if there's not like one straightforward way of dealing with something, I feel like it's definitely hard. But I definitely think finding meaning, and especially like I think they mentioned being okay with two meanings that can be true, and just feeling neutral about the situation can help a lot. Like, for example, I know that they mentioned a missing person, and that when they never come back, you should be okay with the fact that they could be alive or they could be dead. And I just think it's interesting. And I also saw it a little troubling because I don't know how I would be able to balance two different ideas of a conclusion, but I can definitely see how finding meaning is a way to cope through this type of loss.
Yeah, and then going off of that, another one of the strategies that Pauline Boss suggested was normalizing ambivalence, which is kind of what you were starting to say, Sophia, with accepting that you're not really gonna have an answer. And while that's a lot easier said than done, it's definitely something that can happen over time. And having people, I guess, alongside you to help, or having creative outlets or any other ways to just cope with that and acknowledge what you do have and what may be part of a person, whether that's their psychological presence or their physical presence, acknowledging that that's there, and then trying to understand that the other part is lost, and just finding peace with that, even if it takes time and is difficult.
Mhm.
Yeah, totally. I felt like something I've just been thinking, right? Like in terms of the six strategies and how they kind of relate to the losses that I've been through and experienced in my life. I feel like another one that could have been pretty good would be like revising attachment, which was one of the ones that she mentioned, and or like reconstructing an identity, which would be like talking about recognizing a more intricate relationship with the person lost, and really just knowing about like the connections that you have and how they're not only represented by, for example, a parent-child relationship or a grandparent and a child relationship, you know? Like, for example, with a parent and child, right? You're more than just the parent's child. I feel like that's the easiest way to say it.
Mhm.
Um, knowing who you are in relation to the person partially absent or the family member requires like a cognitive and emotional reconstruction of like your roles, status, and boundaries with that person, and really recognizing those boundaries and the role that they play specifically in your life can really show you what to be grateful for, and help you, I want to say, decipher the feelings that you're going through with in terms of ambiguous loss. And that kind of like segues into the revising attachment, which I feel like is just recognizing that the role that they play in your life is an important role, and being able to better comprehend how you feel because of that. Like, for example, the drives to school, the after school conversation checkups with your parent, or just sitting at the dinner table and instead like sitting at a dinner table with them and like looking across the table to see them and have a conversation with them, right? Recognizing those little intricate things and how they play into a parent-child relationship could really help with getting through and wading the waters of like ambiguous loss, I would say. Navigating.
Mhm.
Yeah, I think those two strategies especially are really helpful with making sure that you kind of maintain your own individual identity without letting the loss or the grief consume you, because that can really be easy to kind of make it feel like it's everything, but making sure that you're still present as an individual and like continuing on even when there is that loss. I think that that's super important, and it definitely does take time, but I think that those two strategies are really helpful with that.
Like you were talking about, Theo, like the loss of a parent or a grandparent and kind of mourning the relationship that you had. I can see how people like can go down a path where they think like, why did this happen to me? And this kind of relates to one of Pauline Boss's strategies of adjusting mastery, because the concept of it is basically recognizing that the world is not really just and fair all the time, and no matter how hard you work or the efforts you put towards, like you won't always get the desired outcome. And instead of internalizing the blame and um, just like always staying in this like grieving mindset of like being someone's child and you're not the child anymore, so who are you? It can be very difficult to move on. So I think just mastering like your internal self and your role in life and just like connecting with others is very helpful in coping for ambiguous loss specifically. And I specifically heard in the podcast with Pauline Boss that she mentioned that like the only way to really treat this kind of grief and sadness is human connection, and realizing that just life is more important than grief in a way, though these relationships and these losses are very important. Like we can't stay in this mindset forever, and connecting with other humans is a great way to like foster new relationships and regain like a sense of what it is to be alive in your life and standing.
Mm. Something that I want to add to human connection, I feel like, is uh I think like just thinking back to when I was going through something like that, right? I feel like I kind of just expected that my parent or the person that I loved or someone that played a really big role in my life was going to be there to do their job and really just be there for me to rely on them, right? It's kind of the expectation surrounding the word parent or grandparent, right? And thinking back on that, I felt like it was more of like a privilege, and I think changing my mindset and really highlighting that aspect of human connection would really helped me become more grateful that I had that to begin with, you know. So going through that loss was, I think, a little easier to navigate. Yeah.
The last coping mechanism you could use is discovering new hope, which just entails like seeking help and like seeking people who can help you change your grief into like something positive. In such way could be like getting resources or like doing support groups that actually help you with coping. And like helping you understand what you're feeling, and just having someone there to like listen or like understanding what you're feeling. Because sometimes, personally for me, I don't know about you guys, but I cope with my feelings better when I know that I'm not the only one who's experiencing this, and I know like there's other people who are also sharing these experiences with and are feeling the same thing as me. So then I feel like, oh, then it's not only me, and I know that out there's someone who's also feeling this way. So again, discovering new hope is just by turning your grief into something productive, as in talking to someone and just getting it come to you.
Mhm. I think that also relates to what Theo was saying earlier about
Mhm.
revising attachment. And
Mhm.
I think just a way of viewing your relationship with the person that you lost, if you can just like alter it a little bit to be positive, I think that's another way to channel your grief into like being productive and thinking like, I'm not just his child, like he had a good impact in my life, and he brought me to the place I am today, and I'm grateful for that, instead of like grieving the role that is no longer sustained. But yeah.
Yeah, there's a lot to think about, but I think that the 6 strategies that Pauline Boss mentioned, being finding meaning, normalizing ambivalence, reconstructing identity, revising attachment, human connection, and discovering new hope, all these 6 strategies, it doesn't work for everyone, right? But they're not mutually exclusive, and some people work better with others, and I might work better with one and others with others. So I think wading these waters and navigating ambiguous loss it's good to recognize that it's something special and something different from your normal loss, and it's good to have these strategies. So yeah.
Mhm.
Yeah, thank you so much for listening today. We hope that this conversation about ambiguous loss helped you understand what this term is and how it may be able to help you or understand any losses that you've experienced. We just hope that everything we researched and our own personal experiences could help provide a clear understanding. As Sophia mentioned before, you can go to tinyurl.com/r4bproof, and there is a lot of research that has been done there by us and others. Thank you so much for listening, and we hope that you learned something new.
Thank you.
Thank you.